flatlined for what must have been at least 24 hours, and I'm told it was 48. I most certainly died, and technically can be declared undead in that regard. But when I returned, those recessive genes had kicked in, as I said, when I was 3 years old and had my first kill. When my father's father tried to orally rape me, I ripped his penis off with my incoming teeth. On Kodak Company time, no less, and I've explained the Kodak Company calendar on past transmissions. Years of difference between that and your Gregorian calendrical system. Used until Kodak closed in bankruptcy and an empire of industry died. When I killed him on Kodak Company time, I thought even then, blood's gotta taste better than this. It was so poisoned by so much of that chemical crap running through his system that had poisoned his brain and his nervous system to the point where he was trying to rape his grandchild like it was his due, as casual as one would slap down a dog. He died for his crime. Even after that, I didn't go out seeking to try other blood. I did experiment. This does happen with children, siblings. My sister and I, when she knew of what had happened to me, she gave me some of her own blood. And I can say it tasted sweet, but now I've been cut off. I'm told we're restarting the recording. I'm not sure. Are we actually recording? I'll need some reassurance of that because I don't see the call as active. I don't think I'm even on Skype anymore. So going to need some reassurance from our man about that. And I need to know that this is actually recording before I waste any time going any further. Paul hears me, but does anyone else hear me? I'm going to need a feedback from those that are listening. So I need people to tell me whether they can hear me or not. I'm told people are reconnecting, but I need assurances on the timeline. Someone needs to tell me that they hear me. Now, aside from all that, I'll start once again with describing what was going down between my sister and myself, happily or seriously, within a matter of moments. I don't know if this discussion can be called a happy discussion. So, Daniel Arola still hears me. Good. Thank you, dear brother in battle. Deeply appreciated. And so, with that in mind, we will go forward with the narrative. As painful as it is in some regards, it is something that I do want people to seriously consider before they ever consider going for this opportunity, if you consider it such. It was after that full-body blood transfusion, and what was obviously, fuck the term NDE or near-death experience, a full-death experience, as far as I call it, at FDE. It was then I awoke and was able to tolerate higher levels of blood intake, which I could intake orally by supping. That's the term that's used, not sucking, supping. I could sup on blood and actually subsist off it, actually get enough to subsist off it for a period of time, days, if not a week. Now, all of that, of course, is such that were I to inseminate someone enough times and they suffered some fatal accident, which is nothing I ask anyone to actually try and do to themselves. I would never encourage anyone to do that. But if they were somewhat vamphirdized by myself and there was latent genetic tendencies, conceivably with an accident severe enough, those genes would kick in, as they did with the historical Vladislav Tsepich, who started his life as a vampire hunter. historically. That's why the knighted title, the Son of the Dragon, part of an order of monster slayers. Nothing comic book about this. In the days of Sigismundus, the Emperor of Luxembourg, and of the Holy Roman Empire, you could go to burning at the stake as your sentence if you refused to believe in the reality of werewolves. That was how dire and immediate that threat was for people at that time. I've gone a bit into rabid conditions. We could go into more in the future. Right now, Pavel Edward is tagging myself in a post, which I will share on my public community fan page. I'm going to assume that this is a link he is providing us for the transmission. Reconnecting due to YouTube disruption, which looks like it disrupted my Skype as well. So let me put this onto the public community fan page and pin it to the top. I put a wow on this. Okay. Everybody, take a look for this on my personal friends page or my public community fan page. Coming your way. All right. Let's load this up. Publish it. See if we can finish this up in this hour or going into the next. Pin this up at the top. Okay, that appears to be working. So, my point being, after all that soul searching, to get us back on the subject, so to speak, that you have to be prepared for something that is going to change your life completely in such a manner you will not recognize who you are. So, a fully blossomed vampiraka, vampiris, can partake in a series of martial arts bouts all night in heavy Kevlar padded ballistic armor with threat level 3 trauma plates sewn in front and back, tapping men out left and right, breaking for sexual intercourse with as many meatheads as she has a mind to, if indeed she still swings in that, or any direction, and still be reasonably energetic and alert come daybreak as she was when the night began, albeit more than looking forward to a long day's sleep. There wouldn't even be a need to shower before denning in for the dawn if, as expected, the human sweat glands atrophy and wither away as vestigial to your newly emergent state of embodiment. So why on earth, aside from the potential for exuding a malodorous musk when either stressed or excited, would any girl resist becoming permanently vampirized? Because everyone you ever loved or cared about is now destined to become part of your newly acquired food chain. Pitiful, weak, pathetic, but incredibly, irresistibly delicious. Well, some of them anyway. Just as you wouldn't select a down cow, clearly racked by the ravages of age and disease-addled by extension, to comprise those juicy hamburger patties you used to indulge in before your digestive system mutated. So too the members of the human herd who are falling behind be the ones whose blood you'd regurgitate in revulsion. Only the healthy breeding age hunks will do from now on. And who in the world would want to play with their food? So you can kiss the experience of romance goodbye. Forever. Because the reality of vampirism be no twilight fantasy where you have any choice in the matter of your impulses. To repress your feeding is to die. And all the good-looking ones look only good enough to eat. So that's what could happen if you fully turned. And that's something that should have happened, you would think, to Vladislav Dracula, and indeed it did, to a very real extent, or my mother's father, since he came in through a similar fatal experience that triggered his recessive genes, like the historical Vladislav Cepej. Only his case, of course, in China, and his being ethnically Chinese, descended from the Caucasian bloodline, therefore rather hybridized in his subgenetic structure, down there at the recessive level, through the bloodline of the sons of Seth, the righteous third, the son of Adam, which of course was part of the bloodline which my mother inherited from him. And it could be that, my mother insisted, which of course caused my grandfather to shout, "Come over here, you dirty little redskin," when he tried to rape me orally. He may not have been referring to an American Indian bloodline. He might have been referring to the bloodline of Adam. Adam, of course, being ruddy or red, as in redskin, as in blushing, with blood near the surface of the skin, as Caucasians bear it, where they can bodily blush as no other ethnicity can. My mother said that's what he was referring to. My father said otherwise. I'll be pondering that the rest of my life when I think of it at moments. Now, basically, when we get a situation where I have, of course, encountered one of those vampiraka in the Balkans that was a product of the Soviet state, the actual true-born vampires being genocidally mass murdered in the Soviet Union by being taken to the island of Novaya Zemlya, where after being tortured and experimented upon, those that survived were destroyed in the most powerful atomic blast, thermonuclear blast, ever unleashed in human history. The Tsar Bomba test, the genocide, the king of all bombs. Those that were artificially created by the Soviet state were presumed loyal to the state, and many of them survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, many of them here in the United States. But 'tis in the Balkans where I met the one that had tried to go back home. And I can tell you that, just like in mass media, as sometimes displayed, whether cartoons or in films, I can say for certain that vampira really do weep tears of blood under the sun. Now, when they were dispatched to America on their missions, the Sovietskaya Soyuz, the Soviet Union, was experiencing unprecedented national crises. And the KGB infiltration of the United States' social infrastructure in the early 1970s was thorough and pervasive in a desperate attempt to take America down with them, with the massive social changes they were undergoing in Eurasia. It was known to the KGB by its research into the American society at large that American crime statistics were categorized by Sovietska intelligence in ways that defined American society beyond its own ability to comprehend. In American eyes, vampire belonged to history, myth, and legends. They're kind of the stuff of nightmares. They have no place in the modern world. A mindset of denial that only magnified the value of vampires' insertion assets of the Sovietska communist cause. It was calculated by the KGB that over the less than 200 years of America's existence as a constitutional entity, sporadic waves of immigration from Eastern Europe and Eurasia, exacerbated by what was, at that time, the most recent influx of DPs, displaced persons, refugees from the post-ceasefire Europe of World War II, and secondly, asylum seekers from behind what the West termed the Iron Curtain of what was a Cold War, effectively another World War. These successive demographic waves displaced, at the very least, some 600 true-born vampire around the United States. This was approximately 10 times the number of their own kind that were contemporarily incarcerated at Novaya Zemlya in the 1970s. At any given time, it was roughly tabulated that around 5,000 vampire existed within the environs of the Sovetskaya Soyuz, the Soviet Union's borders, inclusive of the Sovetskaya Central Asiatic Republics, the Soviet Central Asiatic Republics, but exclusive of the Eastern European and Outer Mongolian satellite state populations. The individual predators, those denning inside the borders of the United States of America, had no affiliation whatsoever with the Sovietska state control, but were deemed as an unofficially functioning fifth column, killing approximately 14,400 American citizens annually. Their much more commonly committed repressed feelings, their feedings, left the eventuality of such a disorienting and overwhelmingly unspoken of attack on the average legal American citizen as statistically narrowed down to an approximately 1 in every 1,584 legal residents per 1970s American demography. Now, I've said before, repressed feeding, of course, as does a full feeding, inserts dimethyltryptamine in the system of the victim, which, if they survive, their memory of the experience is actually extraordinarily pleasant, even enlightening, a feeling of having had a religious experience, if one is so inclined, a feeling as if they had had a out-of-body experience, at the very least, if one is more agnostic or atheistic in nature. So with so many people going through such spontaneous feelings during their life, which they had no explanation for, which were actually, in many cases, a vampire attack, you've got a chronic national experience which cumulatively frayed the edges of the social fabric, provided ample opportunity for subversion in any all-too-open non-totalitarian community. In the 1970s, mind you, this isn't to be over-exaggerated or taken to any extreme, and Americans' chances of suffering a vampire attack were only something like 0.0006314%, or far less than 0.5%. This ratio of attack would have decreased dramatically in favor of the potential American citizen once you had this torrential influx of illegal immigrants that buffered the legal population from the vast majority of vampire attacks. Today's attack ratios quite possibly hold steady for the legal American because of a statistically proportionate influx of Eurasian vampire into the United States since the collapse of Eurasian communism. Those that were from the Soviet satellite states, not from the Soviet Union itself, where, for all intents and purposes, the totality of their population of vampire were extinguished in the Tsar Bomba genocide. So it was assigned as an objective of the vampiralka, a female vampire, as created by the Soviet state. Any asset that they were able to insert into America was to try and present herself as the legendary vampire mother and organize this already extant and semi-assimilated, albeit subsistence survival-oriented, vampire community in the United States, always exclusively masculine, an organic vampire insurgency, if you will. The vampiralka, as an asset, was to try and organize them into an operational force of inhuman terror that would instigate a perpetual low-intensity crime wave of ever-increasing repressed feeding assaults to eviscerate America's great society, as so promoted at the time by the contemporary administration of Lyndon Baines Johnson. From the inside out, via the vampire's inherent biochemical ability to steal time, via the repressed feeding creating a sense of lost time or missing time, through, of course, the biochemical insertion of the element of dimethyltryptamine, and invoke delusions, paving the way to popular acceptance of the false sense of security provided by Soviet statism to North America, with ultimate intent to draw the United States into the then ongoing Sino-Soviet conflict at that time. So the mother of all vampire may have experienced catastrophic failure in the sense that the tottering American Republic, under the administrative guidance of Richard Mulhouse Nixon and the United States Secretary of State Henry Alfred Kissinger, sided instead with the Soviet Union's mortal Chinese enemy, the Zhonghua. But these state-created vampire mothers most certainly participated in instigating a chronic convulsion in the seamy underside of American subculture, volitional enough to help sway a terminally destabilized American electorate into the overthrow of their own adamant communist president, Richard Mulhouse Nixon, in time of undeclared war and nigh total war that was ongoing at that time between the Soviet Union and the Communist Chinese on their border, the longest border in the world at the time. Now, the Soviet objective of wartime American regime change was then to be considered a superlative success. So, here we have, when I look back on the legend among actual vampire themselves, true-born predators that do subsist off blood as the totality of their diet, strictly hematophagous. Basically, within the documents that were smuggled out of Soviet Russia that I was able to access at the Presidio, it was known that in the vampire colony, the concentration camp on Novaya Zemlya, that the vampires had a kind of a collective myth or understanding of a vampire mother, a creature whispered amongst themselves as destined to reappear in final times. In an all-male species would, of course, consider that apocalyptic. The confrontation of a creature which combines the vampire's predation and a human woman's natural fertility and reproductive drives. Vampire mothers of ages lost were said to have not one egg, but hundreds. It was also said that the vampire mother's reproductive instincts are so powerful that they overwhelm her instinct for self-preservation, driving such creatures emerging at the dawn of time to copulate with wolves and become inseminated by lupine seed, a haunting echo to the Lilithian myth of Adam's first and fell female mate, who reputedly bedded with animals that she deemed more manly than Adam, thenceforth spawning the satyr and other hybrid races. These are but legends so far as we know, but there be an old Ruskaya proverb which states, "Off from the waters of superstition arises the wispy mist of truth." So could it be that the eggs of such a hypothetical entity have an independent instinct for survival, and that their combined will dominated that of the vampire mothers which carried them? Under such biological parameters, admittedly speculative on my part, vampire mothers might have literally poured so much vitality into creating and energizing their eggs that they drained themselves dry. They would have reproduced themselves to a horrid, mewling, starving death. Could nature have judged this a worthy price to pay in the biological establishment of a predatory counterpoint to the omnivorous primates which evolved into what we identify as humanity? And then we come to the matter of faith itself. Now, there be the myth of the crucis, the crucifix, as a sacred weapon against vampire. It plays no historical role in either the European or Slavonic Eurasian cultures. Certainly priests were involved in vampire intervention throughout Christendom. the cartographic precursor to what we know of today as Europe, but the specific concept of warding off vampire with kreuz or cross or crucifix doesn't mislead the Western mind until the monumentally successful publication of Bram Stoker's Victorian Gothic novel, Dracula. Now, it was brought up to myself by our man, John Warrington, that Alex Jones looks exactly like Bram Stoker, and he put the photographs side by side. I'll be damned if it's not true. And it's so apropos because Bram Stoker was an Irish house nigger to the British Empire who got his success by stealing the work of his wife, publishing it in his own name. Whatever he wrote is unreadable. You can read his other works like The Mummy. Dracula was a bestseller because of its legibility in Victorian terms. It's unreadable today. And Stoker, it must never be forgotten, reimagined the genuine historical Dietrich, the dragon's son, Vladislaus III Bazarab, the devout Christian, the Voivodin, the Voivode, or princely generalissimo, the European equivalent of a Japanese shogun. It as supreme military commander at the national level. Dracula was ruler of the Khanate of Valachiorum, Partium, Transalpinarum, the combined principalities of Wallachia and Transylvania, formerly subjected under the Golden Horde, known to the world as Tsar Źhegyeshku Kazhliki, Lord Sepish the Impaler, assassinated in the field of battle and resurrected via Mythopia to become Nosferatu Rex, the Vampire king. Now, in literature, he is compared to having entered into a pact consummate with Satan himself. It must be brought to bear, cannot be overemphasized, that the Romanian peoples insist that the historic Vladislav Dracula did indeed become vampiri, but under heroically tragic circumstances, as opposed to the lurid literary conceits of Vlad Shepeshku's later-day Irish-descendant British publicist Bram Stoker. And, of course, what Bram Stoker understood when he did his research into the historical Dracula was the fact that he was a devout Christian. And if you read his book, if you could suffer through that oh-so-Victorian Gothic novel, you will see that that novel, it's not misprinted, portrays Dracula as being able to subsist in his coffin safely only when he carries consecrated soil with him, blessed earth. Not cursed earth, blessed earth, earth blessed by his church, which would be, of course, the Byzantine Orthodox Church of the Eastern Slavonic liturgical rite. So only with consecrate earth can Lord Dracula safely travel. This was, of course, understood to people of the Balkans, and it was written into the book of Bram Stoker. Yet later on he contradicts himself and portrays Dracula as increasingly diabolic, not because the character is devolving, but simply because he changes his narrative from the historic into fear pornography as the work continues. But what he had touched on earlier in the book be based on the reality. So the subspeciated branch of humanity known as vampires in the Soviet Union, it was a moot point in an anti-theist or anti-godly state whether vampires held to what the Soviets would have deemed superstitious beliefs. But they certainly felt that the West belief that vampires cannot stand the sight of crucifixes, icons, and other holy symbols of Christianity was, of course, sheer nonsense. They knew that to be nonsense. As a matter of fact, with the inherent disdain that the Soviet Union had for religion, it made it into the records were brought to my attention at the Presidio military base for my destruction under orders, that many vampire deliberately wear crucifixes, not for the purpose of preventing others from suspecting their true nature, but because many of them are extremely religious. The Soviet Union, of course, felt this to mark them as enemies of the state, a religious insurgency, that it was a behavior idiosyncratic of an inherently arrested state of mentation, a subject immediately closed to further discussion because of the theological implications that would have disturbed the atheistic paradigm of the Soviet Union itself. So it was deemed, of course, that the former belief in the Russian Church was an anachronistic cosmology, and therefore God and all nature which be God's handiwork would inescapably be inclusive of vampyrdom, or the vampiric subspecies, because many holy places, be they churches, cathedrals, mosques, or shrines, have proven to be ideal vampiric clutch dominions, consecrated churchyard grounds, having been exposed as epicenters of mass murder. Per Soviet analysis, Dark Ages Slavonic peoples traditionally contending that Trubo and Vampir called to adulation the animalistic vampiroid thralls of the Nosferat contagion, which I described in one of my more recent transmissions. The rabid who had been infected by their kind were called forth from within the bell towers of parish churches on moonless nights, in form mocking that of the imams of Turkieska or Turkey land, ululating from their minarets. All of that must have struck incredible fear into the medievalist population, something the vampires used to their advantage, as they did the thralls that they dispatched to terrorize baseline humanity in preserving their hold on regional power over humanity and among themselves. And, of course, the Soviet Union just took that to be all part of what was deemed the mental illness of religion. That all organized religion and spirituality in general was taken advantage of by predators who decided that because they could bodily bathe in holy waters to no ill effect, they would increase the superstition of those around them to think otherwise, that people would forever be throwing before them obstacles which prevented them in no way, shape, or form from taking advantage of their prey, obstacles which presented them no obstacle whatsoever. And yet, from what I learned from my late and sainted Cyrus, my mother, Diana Dietrich, from a theistic perspective, the full-born, true-blooded vampires who exist in a kind of eternal childhood, indeed in a state of arrested development, manifested a kind of feral spirituality that encouraged them to hold true faith, at least in conviction that they act as the hand of God in population control, that the vampire perceive themselves as a chosen race, chosen as another force of nature, spontaneously taking a toll on the sheep of the lamb, as circumstantially as any earthquake, tsunami, hurricane, tornado, and other acts of God. they would be an act of God. Such ideation places the vampire as a subspeciated ethnos beyond human judgment. So, that, of course, brings us to the fascist vampiric deployment throughout the Commun-Nazi conflict of ever on the side of the Third Reich, and exactly why they were motivated to side with the Third Reich voluntarily while they were exploited by the Soviet Union only against their will. And that brings us back to human interpretations of the Bible. And the sheep of the Lamb of God would read Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 23 and 25, if I remember correctly. But be sure you do not eat the blood, because the blood is the life, and you must not eat the life with the meat. Do not eat it, because you will be doing what is good and right in the eyes of the Lord. Or Leviticus. That would be chapter 17, verses 10 through 11. This provides rationalization right there for unconditional hatred on the part of the human race against the vampire subspecies. I will even set my face against that soul that eateth blood, and will cut him off from among his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. So the human need to wreak destruction upon Vampirdima, or the world of vampirism, seems to be a cyclical phenomenon, coinciding with mass outbreaks of pestilence or plague. Perhaps an understandable phenomenon in light of the Nosferatu contagion, which I so painfully detailed in its taking of 12 million lives in the Soviet Union. I spoke of it in one of my more recent transmissions, more recently. And, of course, such hatreds conceivably incubate in an unconscious defensive biological response to grievous injuries inflicted upon the superorganism of Vampirdime, the vampiric world. All of this was probably most manifest in the communist-organized final extermination of the Vepr. This was, of course, nothing final about it any more than the war to end all wars of World War I. It was called the war to end all wars. That certainly didn't end war. You had a second war to end all wars after that, and that certainly didn't end wars. So the first communist final extermination of the Latin European vampire, the Vepr, did not destroy Vampirdime or the vampires as a species. But it took place during the seminal year following onset of the cataclysmic Spanish flu pandemic, going across all national boundaries, of 1918, the American Army influenza, which effectively ended the Great War to end all wars, World War I, by eradicating 100 million people in 18 months, averaging the mass murder by the Americans unleashing that biological weapon of 185,185 souls per day, every day. 185 daily. 185,185. Superseding the Black Plague in ferocity, which itself had killed 2/3, 67% of the European population. So the advent of modern industrial urbanization did engender a form of childhood's end for Vampirdima, the vampire species, in which a single calendar year, the year my late and sainted sire, George Joseph Henry Dietrich, was born, 1919, becoming branded into the otherwise non-linear vampire racial recall as mutually painful to some and frightening to all. That year that my father entered this vale of tears, the anarcho-syndicalists, a branch of anarchism focusing on the labor movement, syndicalisme, the French for trade unionism, anarcho-syndicalist demagogues organized armed workers into La Guardia Royal Española, the Spaniards' Red Guard, not Royal for royal, more properly, I guess, in the Spanish language, the Español, it would be La Guardia Roja Español, as in rouge, as in red. So the Spaniards' Red Guard took hostage to no less than 300 enterprises in Madrid alone, the capital of Spain. From there, extending terrorist operations across the nation. Having no contractual obligations to honor with which to keep this ever-expanding pool of disenfranchised laborers employed, the ringleaders initiated a purge of the archaic minority population of Eurovepper, parasitizing the body politic, they felt, of both España, Spain, and France, in aftermath of the collapse of the European monarchies. The Vamper, who were interrogated, as transcribed into the records I accessed at the Presidio military base in, of course, the Vamper colony in Novaya Zemlya, north of the polar region in the Soviet Union, recalled it as the Great Slaughter of 1919. Few thousands of adult Vepper and some hundreds of Vepper genetic rape babies were staked, burned, or beheaded. Now, proportionate to the Vamper demon population, those numbers are staggering, statistically equivalent to the genocide of many, many millions if applied in numeric equivalency to the human population base of that same year. The Vepper of Latin Europe had foolishly proliferated when the lights went out in teenage Europe of the 20th century. Feeding flesh came easy with all the breeding-age human males dispatched onto the front lines. Women even offered themselves to Vepper, posing as troops on leave, or in the Espon, or Spanish lands, as French deserters. The butcher's bill arrived as apprehended Vepper blood sons and intercepted Vepper genetic infants, easy enough to identify once one knew what to look for, were roasted alive on spits or nailed to the doors of their succoring mothers' homes to twitch feebly while they gushed out blood like punctured water balloons, always in the merest of moments. The anarchists of the Confederación Nacional do Trabalho, the National Confederation of Labor, had found the perfect recruits for their radicalized carnage. They offered communal whores, women and girls involuntarily press-ganged into mass sex services, and free alcohol, forcibly collectivized, to the newly displaced French and Belgian veterans of 4 years in the trenches and on the killing fields of the Western Front in the first phase of the Greater German Atlantic War, the ones cheated of their youth by shot, shell, and gas, who had nothing to return home to except hunger and repression in the streets. Then, too, the anarcho-syndicalists enlisted the Carmunados, the French socialists, who would later cleave to the Soviet-sponsored Popular Front Army of the Spanish Republic, the Ejército del Frente Popular de la República Española. And these hollow-eyed former cannon fodder, still stinking in their field uniforms, needed something new to kill because they just couldn't stop. They'd been turned on to the killing, and now that the war was over, they had to kill something, if not themselves. So the Gobernitos, the communist Spain's governance, they found willing revolutionaries in the men to whom the industrialized meat grinder of barbed wire artillery and the machine gun had become the only normality they knew. And the communized Español Republicanos, the Spanish Republicans, hunted down and ultimately massacred few thousands more Vepr throughout the deadly, bright, murderous days, scouring the peninsular countrysides for Veprdized sanctums, to the point of firing churches and libraries, and allegedly any facility at all, schools allegedly suspect of harboring clutches. Again, when I accessed the records, I noted the enormity of such fatalities in proportion to the comparative numeric insignificance of the Vaperdima to their human herds, statistically equivalent to many millions more additional to those already perished. The Vepr who survived did so by evacuating Low Country Hispania and Gaul to actually shelter in the very trench and bunker systems that had been so recently fought over during the war to end all wars. Ironically, in the happier times of active hostilities between 1914 and 1918, death on such a heretofore incomprehensible scale was the best natural cover Vepr had ever enjoyed. When 50,000 human men died in a day, the Vepr had no reason to restrain themselves until the Americans disembarked in nominally neutral Hispania, hence the misnomer Spanish flu, and commuted the avian strain of flu with them from the New World to the Old for the first time in all recorded human history, a reverse of all influenza conditions. In grand reversal of the conquistadorial spread of Pax Contagion that had so devastated the indigenous empires of the Americas, incepted by shipping live chickens on troop trains in comportment with recruits commandeered out of San Quentin Penitentiary in an age before refrigerated boxcars. This deployment of biowarfare germination culminated in the mutagenesis of the modern H1N1 influenza, incubated to mass lethality in the training camps of the military bases at Fort Lewis, Kansas. Prior to the United States biointervention in 1917, from coffin ships porting Noaught but avian influenza-contaminated bodies of American troops on arrival to Iberian shores, Vepr fell under the impression before then that European human civilization was going to butcher itself into functional extinction, that the Vepr Nation, the vampire nation, would replace humanity as a dominant species on the continent. If nothing else, the slaughter thereafter compelled a collectively ahistorical species into experiential circumspection. When Vapr become casually brazen, without preparedly staking the borders of their own sovereign national boundaries of territory as a perimeter of defense, catastrophe becomes inevitable. That's when Adolf Hitler offered them Bloodland, the unknown country, with promise of just such recognized and demarcated national perimeters that mobilized the Vapr, the Germanic Vampire of Central Europe, to voluntarily integrate, albeit autonomously, their all-male minority populations into Adolf Hitler's pan-European crusade against Soviet Bolshevism. In 1940, the Sovetskaya Soyuz had invaded and occupied Moldavian, Greater Moldavia, comprising Anti-Romanian Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, in a 60-day campaign through the months of June and July of that year, extending the greater Soviet Union's borders right up against the Romanian region of Transylvania, a former vassal state buffering the most Catholic kingdom of Hungaria-Kárpát, medieval Hungary, from the Islamist Ottoman Empire of medieval Turkey. And by August, now born in blood, both human and otherwise, the Krasnaya Ruskaya, the Red Russian Empire, had already broadcast its intent to communize the world back in what the Bolsheviki, the rule of the majority, proclaimed to be the last year of the Christian calendar. The year my late and sainted sire George Joseph Henry Dietrich was born, 1919. Even as the last of the extant clutch dominions of the Latin Vepr were experiencing extirpation at the hands of Soviet-sponsored Espen insurgency in the Republic of Spain. With the pedigree of mass Vapr slaughter that communism had established for itself, the Vaperdima recognized the truly ultimate blood enemy of their people and rallied in response. Because of the decisive importance of Romanian oil to the German war economy, German troops assumed primary responsibility for the security of the Romanian oil fields. In September of 1940, the Ruskaya-dominated annexation so close to Transylvania justified an even stronger German commitment. And after October of that year, a large German force comprising 12 German divisions was stationed in country. But Romania was never, properly speaking, a German-occupied territory, for the government under Romania's premier Marshal General Ion Victor Antonescu, Presidente al Consiliului de Ministri, martyred via communist execution in 1944. At that time still very much alive and active, was left in absolute control over the nation's affairs, including the production and exportation of Romanian oil. The conjugator, the Führer of the Romanian peoples, al statului Ion Antonescu, was regarded by Adolf Hitler as the strongest personality among his European allies, apart from Il Duce, Benito Mussolini, Andrea Mussolini, the head of the government of the Kingdom of Magna Italia, Greater Italy. And because of this, Romanian as well as Italian troops proved themselves valuable partners in the crusade against Bolshevism by taking the war deep into communism's own home territories. The Royal Fascist Romanian Army was heavily committed into the siege of Stalingrad, Stalin's city. But Hitler's greatest reason for restraint in dealing with Romania was based on his personal experience in investigating the harsh national lessons of the Great War, World War I. In that conflict, the Germans had conquered and occupied the Kingdom of Romania, a military success that had resulted in the destruction of Romanian oil installations and the almost total loss of the Romanian oil supply. Hitler could never afford to repeat this national experience in his own phase of prosecution of the Great German War, because, as Hitler never ceased reminding his colleagues, the lifeblood of the Axis depended on Romanian oil circulation. Yet, in spite of this intrinsically sensitive, energy-dependent relationship, Adolf Hitler compelled Antonescu to yield Transylvania to Magyarország, Hungary, ostensibly in an effort to control part of Magyarország's foreign trade. Even as the greater Sovietska Soyuz, the Soviet Union, was digesting its conquest of Moldavia, in August of 1940, Hitler prompted Magyarország to retake the northern half of Transylvania, including the strategically located city of Cluj-Napoca, which Magyarország had lost to Romania at the cessation of hostilities of World War I. Now, this geopolitical maneuver generated even more hostility between Romania and Hungary. Most Romanians interpreted this as a punishment for siding with the Allies during the First Great War. But Hitler was far more concerned with the perpetuation of tensions between his two Balkan allies in order to distract both of these regional Balkan superpowers from focusing on the primary Nazi zone of occupation situated in the very heart of the Balkan Peninsula, the Banatska, a Magyar or Hungarian ethno-linguistic term, transliterally the military frontier, similar in geographic administrative function to the conquistadorial presidios of the New World. The Banatska Vojvodina, which was a Srpski or Serbian linguistic term. Again, the land of the princely generalissimo, the European equivalent of Japanese shogunacy. This was a trans-Balkanian cartographic legacy from the stabilization of the Roma-Russian, traditionally the transitional ethno-national shatter belt between Roman influence and the Russias. It was a front between the First Reich of the Germanic Holy Roman Empire and Islam following the fall of Byzantium, as it had been a front between the Romans and the Russias before and after. So, an exceptional position in the territories administered by the German military government in Serbia was accorded to the Banatska, the area east of the Tijel River, which was claimed by both Romania and Hungary. On the 12th of April in 1941, Adolf Hitler placed the Banatska Vojvodina under transitional but direct German military control, as opposed to administration under the civilian auspices of the Nazi Party bureaucracy. rendering this entire swath of territory legally equivalent in status to the United States' Guantanamo Bay, supposedly so as not to offend either of Germany's major Balkan allies, but in effect denying any access to the Third Reich's own Nazi civil administration. The Banachka Voivodina, 9,300 square kilometers of rich agricultural land directly north of Beograd, transliterally White City, the capital of Serbia. Population in 1941 of 640,000, comprising 280,000 Serbs, 130,000 ethnic Germans, 90,000 Magyar or Hungarians, and 65,000 Romanians. The Germans were destined to be uprooted altogether to aid in the colonization of the newly conquered eastern territories, while the remnant population was to become the nucleus of an even larger concession, united with the Tija Valley region of Vaslui and the Dvonare, the Danube Valley region of Karash-Severin, with its capital to be established in the city of Timișoara. This was intended as the new Danubian Vamfiore Gau, a Reichsterm for a governmental administration. That's why the Gau leaders, the Gauleiter, were the Nazi bureaucratic equivalent of regional governors. Such a greater Banachkin Voyevodinacy, when envisioned within context of National Socialist plans for the reorganization of Europe along Volkisch, or ethno-national lines of demarcation, would have been both landlocked and surrounded, bordered by no less than 6 surrounding nation-states. Magyarország, Hungary, Transylvania, to be united and recognized as an independent Zekli or Zekler homeland in order to provide a buffer state between fractious Hungary and Romania, Romania itself, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Hrvatska, Croatia. United Banachkin population base, depleted of its Volksdeutsch, or Germanic peoples, and swollen as it was to become with such territorial acquisitions, was to be awarded in toto as bloodchattel to the newly established Werfernation, a Werferdemon nation state that was fully expected to confront the new post-war European order of the Third Reich triumphant with both the challenges and opportunities of coexistence concomitant to humanity's first ever internationally recognized state ruled by a non-human intelligence and sustaining itself literally on the lifeblood of its subject populations. And thenceforth, the bargaining. There were consistent assertions, albeit scattered far and wide, among the multitudinous volumes of World War II-era military intelligence documents that I was ordered to destroy, which stipulated that in return for the consolidation of a Trans-Balkanian national homeland for Europe's Vamfodema, to be christened the Voivodinate, the old liturgical Slavonic term for princely generalissimi, the European equivalent of a Japanese shogunate. This Voivodinate of Vamfan, literally blood monstrum. Adolf Hitler was expectant in return of voluntary Vamfianese. That would be their national name identifying these peoples, transliterally blood monstrumese. He was expected of their voluntary participation in non-lethal German medical research into the Vamfordemic evolutionary condition that would ultimately gift himself with Vamfordization, so that he could conceivably, with continued genetic improvements already sourcing from radical German experimentation on human test subjects, both willing and unwilling, that were producing biogenic advances promising the potential trebling of either humanic or vampiric lifespans, the rule could extend over 1,000 years of the millennial Reich itself. It the irrefutable historical fact that Adolf Hitler underwent an inordinate amount of blood works via transfusion, ever increasing in proportion towards der Gotterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, that heralded the great dislocation of the Third Reich from European soil. Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morelli, became very secretive regards to Führer's conditions, beginning on the 26th of April in 1944, distinctly because Hitler's all too obvious diurnal dysrhythmia, daylight dysfunctionality, was already a factor around which the Allies had been blatantly formulating their combined military strategies. That's where the myth evolves that the Allies were able to succeed at D-Day because Hitler slept late. All of this is, of course, entirely untrue in the sense of misrepresenting Adolf Hitler as lax in his duties to his nation, his state, and his peoples. But it was most certainly true that Adolf Hitler was someone who didn't sleep in the human sense of slumber rhythms, hence diurnal dysrhythmia, daylight dysfunctionality. By December 11th, 1944, Dr. Theo Morell entered into Hitler's medical records, which are available for public review, that der Führer's urine was beer brown, approaching the phosphorescent purple, but lacking the taint of rabies that was subject to the agenital rabid porphyria, meaning non-congenital, actually human-transmitted rabid porphyria that the Russians has experienced that killed 12 million people, but in a controlled medical sense of application that was, instead of rendering Adolf Hitler's condition subhuman, helping him become superhuman. Now, decades into what was then the future, I myself would personally incinerate around half a dozen separately sourced reports which had filtered out of Festung Europa, Fortress Europe, during that time frame. Reports which insisted that der Führer of the Reich, tremulous with Parkinsonian symptoms, was only playing the role of the literally shrinking sick old man of Berlin, utilizing to the fullest both the distortions of the cameras and the acting skills in which he had been so masterfully coached by the Jewish mass mentalist, the theatrical stage magician, Erich Jan Hanussen, born Heinrich Steinschneier. A man, of course, who was missing via being, quote-unquote, murdered via the Reich's Identity Protection Program. A man spared the fires of the Holocaust, relocated himself to an area of the world God knows where, after having performed as Adolf Hitler's double on a number of occasions, to portray an ailing Führer while Adolf Hitler danced the night away with his young mistress Eva. Erich Jan Hanussen had served Adolf Hitler during the early days of der Kampfzeit, the Nazis' party's time of struggle prior to popular mandate. And in the psychological profile of Adolf Hitler conducted by the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA itself, published in 1943 through 1944, it states, and I quote it directly, including the misspelling per the original OSS text of Erich van Hanussen's name, which is spelled correctly Hanussen. They spelled it Hamison, Hamisen. It states in this work before me, during the early 1920s, Hitler took regular lessons in speaking and in mass psychology from a man named Hamison, who was also a practicing astrologer and fortune teller. He was an extremely clever individual who taught Hitler a great deal concerning the importance of staging meetings to obtain the greatest dramatic effect. Then, back in 1945, on the setting stage of the great Nazi twilight on the continent of Europe, in the final performance of Adolf Hitler's whirlwind European tour, he was pretending to be sick and in despair and to be contemplating suicide, presenting what the Russians call a false face, a maskirovka, actually used by the communist reports even though they propagandized they had found his body. And it turned out the teeth and the bones were genetically identified as belonging to a female. Decades later, they actually took a woman and said it was Adolf Hitler because Adolf Hitler, like myself, had always been effete and rather effeminate. Some might call him the first emo child. But not only was Adolf Hitler personifying Maskirovka to his enemies, but also to his immediate inner circle of leadership, even to his Volk, his peoples. Yet actually betraying a physically inhuman level of hyperactivity on unguarded moments. People said he was the most hyperactive individual they had ever run across, who never seemed to tire. Hardly something to gel with that which we are told was what he had become. Obviously energetic enough to take on a fresh and fertile young bride, Eva Anna Paula Braun Hitler. And yet, all the allegations of his play acting, emerging exclusively out of foreign, including Deutsch, or German resistance movements supported by the United Nations, were always contemptuously dismissed by their contemporary American analysts as delusional exercises in resurgent continental European hysterias, mass oppression-induced medievalist regressions worthy of nothing other than professional derision. But Adolf Hitler, of course, escaped. Into Unterland with his bride. And, of course, as he be vamphirized, certainly was displaying the beginning stages thereof, while on the surface world. There may be opportunity yet that I will meet my biological father. So with that, we're at the bottom of the hour. I'll let it go for now. Bless all those who side beside me and who stand behind me. Damn all those who stand against me or before me. And join us again on Wednesday night.